Okay, so hello NS6403. This is the first of two videos about assessment 1, which is your individual presentation, 15-minute presentation on the topic, how does risk help us understand the threats we face in a global world? This little video is going to talk to you a bit about the video itself, the presentation itself, and the kinds of ways that you might think about structuring that. And the second video will talk a little bit more about risk and point to some of the material on risk. So first off, as we say, 30% assessment, 15 minutes, of which really we're looking at for about a 10-minute video presentation. 10 to 12 minutes. 15 minutes is the absolute top. Try not to go below 10 minutes there. There's your boundaries. So the topic is, how does risk help us understand the threats that we face in a global world? As I say, I'll talk to you about risk a bit more in a minute. But generally, what you want to be doing in this presentation then is thinking about those two key sort of aspects in that question. The first one, risk. What is it about risk that we're talking about? Well, we know we're talking about Beck's concept of risk. It's a capital R, there's inverted commas around it. This is Beck's concept of risk, so you need to understand that, and the second video is going to talk to you a bit more about risk as a concept. And then we're talking about threats in a global world. So how is risk helping us understand threats in a global world? So a big part of this presentation is going to have to be about globalization. It's going to have to be about how globalization is associated with Beck's concept of risk and with threats. So there are a number of ways that you could approach doing this. You might start off with a definition of Beck's work on risk. That could be one way to do it, and then you could, through that definition, you could talk about how the concepts involved in that are associated with processes of globalization, and then from that go on to a series of examples. Or you could do it the other way around. You could look initially at globalization. You could provide some definitions of globalization, talk about some of the processes we talk about in globalization, and then overlay that with Beck's concept of risk, how Beck interprets globalization, and then use Beck's concept of risk to explore some case studies there. Either of those approaches would be fine. Now, there's plenty of other ways that you could also do that, but what you do need to get in there is some way of showing us that you understand both what Beck is talking about in his concept of risk and what we mean by globalization, and particularly what the kind of global processes that we might associate with risk might be. So then we talked maybe about an example, about a case study. In the advice online, on the module guide, it talks about a range of suitable examples. So you might have one big example, for example. You could talk about environmentalism, or the threat from nuclear proliferation, or disease, or war, or any of the things that we've talked about in the modules. There's a range of very good examples in some of the material from the World Economic Forum, which are on some of the slides there that we looked at. In fact, I think we looked at some of that material in one of the latter sessions. It was one of those that was rearranged. So maybe you could look at some of that, some of those for ideas on how risk might work. Dave gave you a load of good examples. Dave talked about issues around fear and threats and globalization, disease. I talked to you about the dark side of globalization. So there's a number of examples that you could use there to illustrate this. Again, you could use examples at the end as a way to sort of show the kind of issues you're talking about, or you could maybe dot examples throughout to make particular points about risk and about threat, and about the association between those things in a global world. So Beck's concept of risk, the way that ties into globalization, and the way it helps us understand the threats that we face. So again, if you look on the module guide, you will see under the directions for the assessment, the learning outcomes that we've got there for assessment 1. So the first one is demonstrate a good level of knowledge on the multifaceted processes of globalization. Again, so I want you guys to be able to show me that you understand what globalization is about, that it's multifaceted. In other words, there's lots of things going on, and in this context, that there's lots of things going on, and that's associated with issues to do with risk. And then the other learning outcome, use case study material to illustrate how specific examples relate to wider issues of global security. So there we go. That's about how you can feed in your big example or several smaller examples to show or to ground effectively some of the theoretical concepts you're talking about. You're telling us that risk is part of globalization. You're telling us that globalization has many threats, and you're using examples to illustrate where that actually happens, or where that might happen, because of course risk is not about things that have happened. Risk is about things that might happen, which ties us nicely into the second video on risk and what risk is. So I will see you folks in a minute.